Welcome to Talking Africa, the podcast that takes you behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. My name is Nick Norbrook. Please visit theafricareport.com for all the latest news, analysis and opinion, and sign up there to our daily brief. On the pod today, we tackle the question, is China exporting its authoritarian politics via its export of communication technologies? While the world debates 5G tech and the US takes aim at China's telecoms giant Huawei, this is a live topic across the continent too. From internet blackouts in Ethiopia to facial recognition software in South Africa to the recent public embrace by Nigerian politicians of China's own social media policies. It's not so simple, says Iginio Gagliardone, who's a research fellow at the University of Oxford and who splits his time between South Africa and Ethiopia. He's written a book on the subject called China, Africa and the Future of the Internet. We start back in 2008, when he took a wrong turn in the corridors of Ethiopia's state telecoms company and discovered the offices were full of Chinese engineers.
I managed to secure an interview with the CEO of what at the time was called the Ethiopian Telecommunication Corporation. So I was on the top floor. We had a very good interview. It lasted way longer than I expected. And I was happy, exhausted, and I cleared my agenda because, that's what you do when you're interviewing someone important. And I started wandering on the top floor and of Video Telecom. And there were a few doors that were open. And I noticed that, surprisingly, rather than being staffed with Ethiopian engineers and computer scientists, they were actually, all of them were staffed by Chinese engineers. And I'm not a journalist, but I thought, wow, there is a very interesting story here to be told. And that's how it started, looking into what China was doing in Ethiopia at the time. And what I found, and I hope I describe it in enough detail in the book, was actually fascinating. That was very much the beginning. I think very few people were talking about China and the internet. There was a lot of talk about trade, infrastructure, highways, and so forth. But telecommunication was a story very much in the beginning. And as we know now, because of Huawei, because of many controversies, it's very much in the headlines.
People, obviously, they want to believe in this unified plan in China's actions in Africa, which I guess is this unitary actor fallacy. But of course, not only are there competing visions between power centers in China, provisional governments, central government, Chinese private sector, but then each African country has its own set of actors. And so we see something different happen in each place. Did you discover any sort of broad differences, though? You compared Chinese engagement, technological cooperation, ICT, in Ethiopia, in Rwanda, in Kenya, and Ghana, two of which are perhaps more open as political systems, two of which are perhaps more closed, Ethiopia and Rwanda being the closed ones. What were the big tendencies that you saw?
And as you said, at the beginning of this engagement, the expectations mostly not coming from China or from Africa, but from the global north, for China's competitors, the United States above all, was that China could have a master plan, China the template approach, and I decided to take some of these claims at face value and saying, why don't we analyze more closed regimes and more open regimes and seeing whether or not, as some were claiming, engagement with China will lead to greater authoritarianism. And what I found is not necessarily the opposite, but it's a very diverse picture. And when it comes to Ethiopia, China has come with the largest loan in the history of telecommunication in Africa, more than $3 billion. And it helped the Ethiopian government achieving what could be considered a very stubborn project of expanding access in a regime of monopoly. And when it comes to Kenya and Ghana, China was somehow a latecomer. And these two countries opened up telecommunication very early on. Big players like Vodafone and MTN and others had already come into the scene. And China was just one of the many. And so it had to fit and accept what was the state of telecommunication at the time. And it never achieved an hegemonic position. And I think Rwanda is probably the most interesting story here, because when it comes at regimes type, obviously Rwanda and China are incredibly different when it comes to size. But when it comes to the political regime, they are probably the most similar in the group of countries that I've analyzed. They have somehow autocratic, left-leaning leadership, one that had a very transformative effect if we think about Rwanda after the genocide and where Rwanda is now. And so despite authoritarians, there's a high level of legitimacy. And also when it comes to surveillance, the apparatus of surveillance in Rwanda, it's really pervasive, and not just talking about electronic surveillance, but also one-to-one, people-on-people surveillance. And yet, when it comes to telecommunication, China had a very small footprint in Rwanda, and the country and the companies that helped Rwanda transforming and achieving 4G access all over the country was actually South Korea, and it was not China. So the picture that comes out is very much of a lot of diversity and adaptation to the pre-existing situation that is found in a place. That doesn't mean that things won't change, but the narrative of China's going to come and zip these countries in the direction of authoritarianism just doesn't hold true.
So this was a question that you are continually asked, as you make clear. Is China promoting an authoritarian version of the internet in Africa?
Yeah. So the thing that the answer, I provide different answer in different parts of the book. So the answer is layered, meaning that if we look at the discourses coming from Chinese authorities, but also Chinese companies, we won't find anything claiming that the Chinese model is a better fit for Africa. And this is just simply not in the public domain. And this is relevant because actually pre-existing competitors, especially when it comes to the internet, let's think about the United States, have been very vocal in promoting specific ideas. So many would have expected that as much as the US had said, well, the internet has to be free and open and unfettered and led by the private sector with minimal involvement by governments, China would have said something different. And yet there is very little coming from, again, on the records coming from Chinese authorities. At the same time, and I think this was a finding that emerged over time, that doesn't mean that China is not actually leading, because of its engagement, to a more closed version of the internet. So here is a paradox that is quite difficult to unpack. So we have seen, as you said also at the beginning, a number of countries, Uganda, Nigeria, Cameroon, trying to promote or to justify a more closed idea of the internet. But there have been a number of internet shutdown, and this has been simply like justified as like, what is in our rights. But when it comes to publicly explaining why, the agenda, the discourses that are referred to are not those coming from China, at least for a long time they haven't been, but those coming actually from the United States, the so-called securitization of development. So what heads of states are saying, we don't want destabilization. Destabilization is bad for the economy, or in some cases even worse, we want to prevent a terrorist group from abusing the internet and promoting hatred online. And so this is the agenda that is publicly embraced. And then when this is justified, ideas coming from the West are those put out there in the public. But then it could be Chinese technology and resources, they're actually making that possible. So you have this kind of unholy alliance between discourses from the West and technologies from the East that actually are leading to a more closed idea of the internet. But it's very difficult to point of who is to blame and the different variables and how they combine and they together they may lead to certain results.
You kick off chapter 4 with this great quote from Sebat Nega, the founder of the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, about China having, the most informed people in the world, and he sort of goes on to connect that with the responsiveness of Chinese leaders to the demands of the people. And this is, this feels like it's a whole theoretical framework for him, doesn't it? And a highly attractive one. Does that explain the sort of the closeness of people in Ethiopia's regime with China? Perhaps their desire to take China's fusion of communication technology and political control as some kind of a model, or perhaps just a tool?
The one with Sebat Nega was a fascinating encounter, and it's also further layers what we just discussed. So in the public domain, China is very seldom mentioned, but behind closed doors, in private, things are very much different. So the beginning of my conversation with Sebat was spun by actually a WikiLeaks cable, where it was revealed that in a conversation between Sebat Nega and the US ambassador at the time, Donald Yamamoto, Sebat was so blunt to say, well, actually, we're looking up at the Chinese. It was kind of like aggressively pushing back Americans' demand for openness. And then when I met with Sebat, he was already an old man at the time. And I mentioned that cable, and he had no idea that conversation had been in the public domain. But rather than sort of like hiding back and looking, he looked somehow surprised, but actually doubled it down. It sort of said to me, as it's then reported in the book, what you refer to. We do admire the level of sophistication that Chinese authorities have achieved in the ways they can surveil public communication, and they can influence it. So much so that he continued saying, we will never get there. It's just too complicated. But that doesn't mean that we can't try. So there is this sense of like in private, and things again might change, that the Chinese model is seen as a very sophisticated, very nuanced way to contain debates, especially in countries that are struggling with legitimacy, economic development, and in imposing in some cases, or like further legitimizing a political forms of domination that has its own cracks. At the same time, and maybe I can articulate it further later on, there is also an historical dimension in this that we have to consider, because right now with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the TPLF is very much not in control. It's struggling to maintain controls, and it seems that actually Abiy has been accused of exactly doing the opposite, of being too friendly with Western powers and having disconnected with China to some extent. And so it would be interesting to see now that also in Ethiopia the telecoms are going to be liberalized, if that's let's say special relationship with China that Ethiopia has developed will continue because of kind of structural component that are there and will be difficult to shift, or actually think will be different. So the relationship are always in movement, and I think Ethiopia right now is a very interesting space to watch, exactly because of these possible transition.
It is absolutely fascinating, and I forget his name, but there was one of the three vice presidents who was head of intelligence for a while, and also
it was Debretsion Gebremichael.
That's the one, yeah. And he was also very involved in the high tech and telecom stuff, as I remember.
Very much, and it's and interesting because it's always one thing that is definitely similar between Ethiopia and China is it's very difficult to get into the